Columbus, Ohio, August 2016. When 68-year-old William Fleming was admitted to the hospital after a heart attack, his family felt nothing but gratitude he had survived. The doctors were professional and kind, especially the nurse assigned to him, a woman named Haley. She was warm, attentive, compassionate, always smiling, always near. The family trusted her, after all. Someone with a face like that couldn't be faking it, right? But after a couple of weeks, William's son Daniel began noticing strange things. His father grew more sluggish, complained of disturbing dreams, and sometimes fell silent when asked about the night shifts. Then, one night, just after Haley stepped out of the room, William whispered to his son, "Sometimes she's not who she seems to be." The family installed a hidden camera disguised as a painting on the wall. They thought they might capture neglect, but what the footage revealed left them frozen. The nurse wasn't just playing a role. She had a plan, and their father was only the beginning. William Fleming had never been a man who believed in signs or omens. As a retired college professor of history, he preferred evidence, dates, and logic, things that could be measured, cross-examined, and explained. That's why when he clutched his chest in the middle of the garden behind his house on a warm August afternoon, he didn't think about mortality or fate. He thought about how the sharp pain felt like something he might have read about in a case study, distant and clinical. He didn't remember much after that, just fragments. The sound of his wife Mary calling his name, the flashing red lights of the ambulance, the sudden coldness of oxygen tubes and brisk voices giving commands above him. And then darkness. He woke up in a room that was too white and too still, too still. Kind of space where time didn't move in minutes, but in slow, controlled medical routines. Machines beeped in steady rhythm, IV lines trailed into his arm, and the sterile scent of antiseptic clung to everything. It was the cardiac observation wing of St. Joseph Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. The doctors said it was a moderate heart attack. One artery had been dangerously close to being fully blocked, but they had acted quickly. They implanted a stent, stabilized his vitals, and started him on a post-infarction protocol. He would live, they said, and perhaps that should have been enough. For Mary and their son Daniel, it was. They were shaken, of course, but immensely relieved. William had always been the pillar of their family, measured, calm, the one who made sure lights were turned off before bed, that everyone made their dentist appointments, that every holiday letter was mailed on time. Watching him lie in that bed, pale and diminished, was like watching the foundation of a house crack. But the doctors reassured them that he was strong. He just needed rest, medication, monitoring, time. The hospital room was clean and quiet, with pale blue walls and a single window overlooking the hospital's east courtyard. The days passed in routine. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, changing 4 bags, adjusting pillows. Visitors filtered in, colleagues, former students, church friends. But the one constant was Nurse Haley Bryant. She had introduced herself. The first morning after William regained consciousness, her presence immediately warm and reassuring. She was in her early 30s, with dark blonde hair always neatly tied back, a professional calm about her that made Mary think of a schoolteacher or a librarian. Haley had an easy way of making people feel cared for, even in the cold structure of a hospital. She always had time for a little extra conversation, a story about a patient she once had, or a compliment for William's patience. Mary grew fond of her quickly. Daniel did too. He even joked once that he wished someone like Haley had taken care of his grandfather back in the day. Haley responded with a small, modest smile and a gentle pat on William's hand. She called him Professor when she came in, and William, usually uncomfortable with formality, didn't seem to mind. Life within the walls of that hospital room adopted a rhythm. Haley's shifts became familiar bookends to their day. She was always there in the mornings, bright and professional, taking vitals with precision and confidence. In the afternoon, she would return for small talk and medication. Even on nights when she wasn't on the rotation, she would sometimes pop her head in just to say hi, claiming she had forgotten something or was checking on a test result. Mary found it sweet. Daniel appreciated the consistency. William, for his part, remained quiet but didn't object. The days were uneventful, which is exactly what they had hoped for. William responded well to medication. His appetite began to return. His color improved. Nurses commented on how quickly he was recovering for someone his age. Mary read to him from old history books they brought from home. Daniel would sit near the window and take work calls quietly while glancing at his father. It felt like the crisis was over, and now they were just waiting for the release date. A few more days of observation, a physical therapy session or two, and he would be discharged to finish his recovery at home. That was the plan, and everyone, including the hospital staff, was confident in it. It was during these days of calm that Haley seemed to become part of the family's routine, not just as a nurse but as a reassuring presence. She remembered details. She brought William tea the way he liked it, weak with lemon. She hummed softly while adjusting his blankets. She once brought him a small crossword book and said he reminded her of her grandfather. Mary thought she was an angel. Daniel thought she was a professional. William said little. He was never a man of effusive praise, and his medication sometimes left him tired. But he nodded when she entered. He thanked her when she left. Everything about her seemed right. Nothing felt out of place. In fact, if there was one constant in the unpredictability of the medical experience, it was Haley. That's why when things began to change, it was so hard to see it. So hard to believe that the same person who had smiled so gently, who had adjusted William's oxygen line with such care, could be the reason his condition suddenly began to turn. But that hadn't happened yet. For now, the room remained bright, orderly, and calm. The machines blinked in regular rhythms. William slept soundly most nights, and the family clung to the belief that everything was going to be fine. It was a moment of false peace, a fragile interlude before the unraveling. And as the days went by, no one noticed the subtle way William began to flinch in his sleep, or how his eyes would linger on the door after Haley left, as if expecting something else to follow. The storm hadn't started, but the clouds had already gathered. It started with small changes, subtle enough to ignore, yet persistent enough to linger in the back of the mind like a whisper you can't quite catch. William's recovery had been going well, and for a time, everything seemed routine. But then, little by little, the rhythm of calm began to shift. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so quiet that it might have gone unnoticed if not for how deeply the family paid attention to every beat of William's recovery. Mary noticed it first, though she didn't immediately put it into words. William, who had once greeted her with a tired but genuine smile, now seemed more distant. His eyes didn't light up when she entered the room. Sometimes he didn't even turn his head. She chalked it up to fatigue, perhaps a bad reaction to medication. After all, post-cardiac patients often experienced mood swings and periods of confusion. That's what the doctors had told them, and she had no reason to doubt them. But then, there were the dreams. William, once a deep and peaceful sleeper, had begun to mumble in his sleep. Short, fragmented words, sometimes whole phrases, often unintelligible. Mary would wake up from her cot in the corner of the room to the sound of his voice, strained and quiet, as though he were having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. He would furrow his brow, grip the sheets tightly, and once he cried out so suddenly that she rushed to his side. He didn't remember any of it in the morning. Daniel, more skeptical by nature, attributed it to the side effects of medication. He even researched its sedatives and blood pressure drugs could cause vivid dreams, even hallucinations. But it was more than that. One morning he arrived earlier than usual, and found William awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, hands gripping the sides of the bed. When Daniel greeted him, there was a delay in his response, as though his father had to drag himself out of some fog to remember where he was. His voice was dry and flat, not the groggy warmth of a man slowly waking up, but something colder. Later that day, as Daniel adjusted his father's blanket, he noticed something else. A bruise on the inside of William's left wrist. It was small and faint, but it wasn't there the day before. When he asked about it, the attending nurse, someone knew, not Haley, said it was likely from the fall or maybe a restraint used during the night if William had been restless. Again, a plausible explanation. Hospitals were full of them, but the bruises didn't stop. Over the next few days they began to appear in other places. A small one on the upper arm, a purplish mark near the base of the neck, all in areas that could easily be dismissed as accidental, but the accumulation began to weigh on Daniel's mind. He asked Haley once, offhandedly, if his father had been agitated during the night. She smiled warmly, shook her head, and said he had been calm, peaceful, even. Her answer was perfect, her tone unchanged, her eyes steady. Still, something in. Her voice rang hollow. Then came the missing items. Mary's scarf, which she left on the chair by the window, disappeared one night and was found 2 days later, stuffed behind the bedside drawer. A paperback novel Daniel had been reading vanished, only to reappear in the laundry hamper by the nurse's station. They laughed it off. Hospitals were chaotic. People misplaced things. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken. Still, it felt off, too coincidental, too frequent. Like something or someone was testing boundaries. And William began to change too, not physically, but emotionally. His once alert demeanor was replaced with a kind of subdued obedience. He stopped requesting things, stopped asking questions. When nurses came in, he would close his eyes and pretend to sleep. His expressions grew more guarded, and he avoided eye contact. Even with Mary, he spoke less. One evening, when she was holding his hand, she felt his fingers tense as footsteps approached the room. He didn't look at the door. He didn't say a word. But she felt his fear in the way his grip tightened slightly before letting go. Haley remained a constant. Her kindness never wavered. She smiled the same. She spoke in the same gentle, melodic voice. She complimented Mary's resilience and Daniel's loyalty. She greeted William with care, adjusted his pillow, administered his medications, and never once gave them any reason to doubt her, at least not openly. But beneath the perfection, something didn't sit right. There was an emptiness in her eyes sometimes. Moments when she was caught off guard and her face would freeze for just a split second before returning to normal. Then, one night, as Daniel was packing up his laptop, William whispered something. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. He said he didn't like being alone at night. That sometimes he would wake up and she would be standing there already too close, too quiet. He didn't accuse her of anything, didn't say what she did or didn't do. But the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table in his apartment, staring at nothing, his thoughts cycling. Could this all be real? Was his father's fear just a side effect of trauma and medication? Or was it something more? He thought about the bruises, the missing items, the way his father recoiled at the sound of soft shoes in the hallway. He remembered how Haley always seemed to arrive just a second before they expected her, how she never appeared startled, never showed fatigue. Her presence had become too smooth, too polished. There was one moment that finally pushed Daniel from doubt into certainty. A nurse came in to check William's vitals while Daniel was visiting. She flipped through the chart and offhandedly mentioned a dosage adjustment that had been made the night before. But when Daniel checked the printed medication log, something he had been quietly tracking, the change wasn't recorded. He asked about it. The nurse looked confused. She said she hadn't made the adjustment. Neither had the evening staff. She double-checked. Still nothing. Daniel felt a slow, creeping cold rise in his chest. The change had happened. William's vitals had shifted slightly since the previous night. The question was, who had administered it? And that was when he knew. It wasn't just William's mind playing tricks. It wasn't confusion or age or medication. Something was wrong. Deeply, unnervingly wrong. Haley wasn't who she claimed to be. The signs had been there all along, faint, scattered, but unmistakable. Once they were seen for what they were, Daniel didn't say anything to his mother just yet. He didn't want to alarm her. But that night, when he returned to the hospital room with a soft canvas frame containing what he said was a family photo, he made sure to hang it on the wall facing the bed, just above the cabinet where Haley always stood to check William's for. Inside the frame was a small, motion-activated hidden camera. The next chapter wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was about discovery. And Daniel knew the moment they reviewed the footage, everything they feared or worse would be confirmed. Daniel didn't sleep the night he planted the camera. He lay on his side in the guest bed at his mother's house, staring at the ceiling, hands crossed over his chest, heart pounding in a rhythm that mimicked fear more than fatigue. Everything about the past 2 weeks had led to this moment. And yet the very idea of spying on someone, a nurse, a healthcare professional trusted, with his father's well-being felt like crossing a line. But every part of his rational mind told him that line had already been crossed, not by him, but by someone who was supposed to protect, not harm. The small device had arrived via express shipping just a day earlier. It was shaped like a digital photo frame, matte black with a faux wood border, sleek and modern enough to blend in without drawing attention. Hidden inside was a pinhole camera, motion-activated, with enough memory to store multiple nights' worth of footage and the ability to stream directly to Daniel's phone if he chose to connect it to the hospital Wi-Fi. He opted not to. The less data transmitted, the less chance someone would notice. He had thought through the placement for days, even before the final decision to purchase the camera. The wall opposite his father's bed was the only viable angle. It provided a full view of the room door, four-stand chair, and part of the bed. William wouldn't notice it. His vision wasn't sharp at a distance anymore, and the nurses rarely paid attention to wall decor. It was perfect. Daniel arrived at the hospital the following morning early, much earlier than usual. Mary had gone home for a change of clothes and some rest, and William was asleep, mouth slightly open, breathing slow and shallow. The nurse on duty, a young man named Isaac who didn't know the family well, gave him a distracted nod as he scribbled notes on a chart near the nurse's station. Daniel slipped into the room, hung the photo frame exactly where he had planned, and turned it on. It hummed silently to life, lens facing the room, invisible to the untrained eye. Daniel sat with his father a little longer than usual that day. He read aloud from the newspaper, fiddled with his phone, occasionally checking to ensure the red lead hidden deep within the lower rim of the frame remained dim. It meant the device was recording. It meant it was watching. That night, Daniel lay in bed, the device synced to his phone in offline mode. He didn't stream the footage in real time. He wanted a clean break, no distractions. In the morning, he would retrieve the micros card and view it on his laptop. He didn't expect to find much on the first night, just some routine checks. Maybe a nurse changing a bag or adjusting pillows. That's how it always went in these kinds of stories, didn't it? You look once, find nothing, question your sanity, and then look again. Only the second time do the cracks appear. Only the second time do the shadows move. But this wasn't a story. And he would only need to look once. The next morning, he returned to the hospital with the same rhythm as always: greet the front desk, pass the familiar halls, smile at the nurses he didn't trust. Haley wasn't on the morning shift, which was both a relief and a disappointment. It made retrieving the camera easier. He slipped the frame off the wall while William dozed with his eyes half open, swapped out the memory card, replaced the device, and sat with his father like any other. Morning. Back home, the laptop whirred to life. The footage loaded. The screen showed the room exactly as he had left it, still, quiet, sterile. He scrubbed forward, skipping hours of inactivity. Mary visited briefly in the afternoon. A nurse entered and exited. William turned in bed, murmured in his sleep, adjusted his blanket. Then, around 2:16 a.m., the door creaked open again, and there she was. Haley Bryant entered slowly, deliberately, without announcing herself. The room lights remained dim, only the monitor beside the bed casting a pale green glow. She moved with a practiced fluidity, glancing once at the hallway before closing the door behind her. There was something different about her posture, more rigid, her movements more calculated than during the day. She approached William's bedside, stood silently for a moment, then leaned down and whispered something inaudible. William stirred slightly, but did not wake. Haley straightened, walked to the IV stand, and without hesitation produced a small vial from her pocket. She inserted it into the injection port, slowly, almost reverently, depressing the plunger as though performing a sacred ritual. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. After a moment, she removed the vial, wiped the injection site with a sterile pad, and returned the pad and syringe to her pocket. She then pulled the blanket up around William's chest, leaned over him again, and said something else, something that made William flinch, even in sleep. Then she left. The room returned to stillness. The digital clock on the monitor blinked. William shifted once, twice, then went still again. Daniel sat frozen in front of the screen. His throat had gone dry. His palms were damp. There it was, proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof that Haley had administered something off the record, something unmonitored, something never charted. But the worst part wasn't the syringe. It wasn't the secretive behavior. It wasn't even the quiet, predatory way she had stood over his unconscious father like a ghost in a horror film. It was her face. There had been no kindness in it. Not the gentle nurse they had come to trust. Not the soft-spoken caregiver who brought William crossword puzzles and remembered how he took his tea. Her expression in those moments, blank, void of emotion, maybe even pleased, was something Daniel would never forget. He watched the footage again, paused it, zoomed in. Her eyes were dead. Her lips barely moved. She was not the person they had believed her to be. She had fooled them all, expertly, effortlessly. And whatever her reasons, Daniel knew now that William's decline hadn't been natural. It had been orchestrated. He copied the footage to an external drive, labeled it plainly, and locked it away. By the time he returned to the hospital later that day, Haley was gone. A different nurse was on shift, one he'd never seen before. Daniel said nothing to his mother yet, not until he had a plan, not until he knew how to use what he had, because the camera had told the truth, and the truth was worse than anything he had imagined. Daniel had always considered himself a measured person, someone who didn't act out of impulse or emotion. But after watching the footage from the hidden camera, something inside him shifted slowly, at first, then all at once. The image of Haley, injecting something unknown into his father's foreline in the dead of night, her face devoid of empathy, had carved itself into his memory with surgical precision. It wasn't just a violation of medical ethics or hospital policy, it was a violation of trust so complete, so intimate, it bordered on the monstrous. And now he was carrying a terrible knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. Something had to be done, but the how wasn't immediately clear. He sat in his apartment for hours after retrieving the footage, staring at the blinking cursor on a blank email draft addressed to the hospital administration. What would he say? That he had illegally recorded one of their nurses without consent? That he had definitive proof of misconduct that could potentially upend careers, destroy reputations, and launch lawsuits? Everything hinged on how he framed the truth. He couldn't afford missteps, not when his father's health and safety were still in jeopardy. He needed precision. He needed leverage. So instead of pressing send, Daniel picked up the phone and called a lawyer. The attorney, a longtime family acquaintance named Janet Ruiz, listened in silence as Daniel laid everything out: the bruises, the inconsistencies, the missing log entries, and finally, the footage itself. When he finished, she didn't interrupt. She let the silence settle for a beat before speaking. Her voice was calm but clipped, controlled in the way people speak when they're measuring the depth of the fire they're about to walk into. She told him to bring the footage to her office the next morning, along with a copy of William's chart if he could get it. Discretion was crucial. No one at the hospital could know what they had yet. The next morning, Daniel arrived early to the hospital under the guise of visiting his father. Mary was already there, sitting by the bed, gently reading from a newspaper. William looked tired, his eyes duller than usual, his body sunken deeper into the mattress than it had been just a week before. Haley was not on duty. In her place was a different nurse, and for the first time in days, Daniel felt a faint flicker of relief. He kissed his mother on the forehead and told her he'd return later that afternoon. Then he excused himself and left for Janet's office. Her firm occupied a modest, second-floor suite in a nondescript brick building in downtown Columbus. The office smelled faintly of coffee and dry paper. Daniel sat across from her at a large wooden desk as she plugged the external drive into her laptop. Together, they watched the footage. She said nothing, her eyes fixed on the screen, taking notes in a small leather-bound journal. When the clip ended, she leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and let out a long, slow breath. They discussed the next steps. First, Janet would file a formal complaint with the Ohio Board of Nursing, anonymously at first, accompanied by redacted copies of the footage. Then she would contact the hospital's legal department directly, offering them a chance to address the issue internally before the family went public. This gave them time to act, time to remove Haley from her position without the pressure of public scandal, at least initially. If the hospital cooperated, the matter could be resolved quietly with disciplinary action, revocation of her license, and possibly criminal charges if they found further evidence. But if they tried to hide it, if they attempted to bury the footage or retaliate against the family, Daniel would go to the media. That afternoon, the first domino fell. The hospital administrator called Mary's phone while she was in William's room. Daniel had already briefed her on what to say. She passed the phone to him, and within an hour, he was in a small, private meeting room on the hospital's fourth floor, facing a panel of executives, compliance officers, and legal counsel. No one smiled, no one offered coffee. It was not a meeting, but a reckoning. Daniel explained everything as calmly and thoroughly as he could. He presented the footage on a hospital-issued laptop, making sure to maintain a neutral tone. He didn't accuse, didn't raise his voice. He just showed them what had happened, what they had missed under their own roof. The silence in the room after the footage ended was thick and prolonged. The administrator, a woman in her 60s with tightly pinned silver hair and horn-rimmed glasses, leaned forward and quietly asked him to step out for a moment. Daniel waited outside the door, pacing slowly down the hall, watching the nurses pass by as though the world inside the hospital had not shifted, but it had. Whether they knew it yet or not, everything was about to change when they called him. Back in, the tone of the room had shifted. There was no longer disbelief, only urgency. They assured him they were taking the matter seriously. Haley Bryant was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full internal investigation. They would be reviewing her patient logs, speaking with staff, and coordinating with the Department of Health. They thanked him for coming forward and asked for a copy of the original footage. Janet had already advised him not to give it. Instead, he provided them with a redacted version, keeping the original drive locked in a safe at her office. The hospital didn't press out. The news traveled quickly, though not to the public. Within a day, Haley was gone. No formal explanation was given to the staff, no internal memo circulated. Her name was quietly removed from the rotation, her ID badge disabled. But the whispers started almost immediately. Nurses exchanged glances in hallways, staff clammed up when Daniel walked past. He could feel the shift in atmosphere every time he entered the building. His family's trust in the system had collapsed and everyone knew it. But despite the resolution, there was no sense of victory. William remained weak, drained from whatever medication had been administered during those nights of silence. No one knew exactly what he had been given or in what quantity. There were no visible side effects, no traceable toxins or long-term damage, but something had been taken from him all the same: his energy, his clarity, his ability to look at the people who cared for him without fear. Mary cried when Daniel told her the full story, not because of the danger, but because of the betrayal. She had trusted Haley. They all had. She remembered the tea, the crossword puzzles, the gentle words. It felt like a script, a performance, tailored to disarm them. And it had worked. Janet warned them there might be media attention once the report reached the licensing board. But for now, the family had done everything they could. The exposure was complete. The lie had been dragged into the light. And even though there were no cameras left on the walls, Daniel could still feel the sense of surveillance, only now it was reversed. Now the eyes were on the hospital, on the administration, on every nurse who entered that room. He didn't trust anyone. Not anymore. And he wasn't sure if he ever would. The aftermath of the exposure settled into the hospital like a slow, chilling fog. On the surface, the facility appeared unchanged. Nurses still walked the halls in pairs, pushing carts and checking charts. Families still gathered around bedside tables with flowers and thermoses of coffee, whispering quietly to loved ones. The monitors still beeped in steady intervals, and the automatic doors still sighed open with mechanical indifference. But beneath the surface, everything was different. The illusion of trust, of routine and care, had been punctured. And in the vacuum it left behind, something colder began to grow: suspicion, tension, and resentment. Daniel noticed it first, though at first he couldn't put his finger on it. The nurses avoided eye contact. Some greeted him tersely, others not at all. Conversation stopped abruptly when he walked into the hallway. The warmth that had once existed between his family and the staff had evaporated. They had gone from being sympathetic visitors to a family that had quietly accused one of their own. The unwritten code of silence that sometimes formed among hospital staff, the expectation of discretion, loyalty, and internal resolution had been broken, and Daniel was the one who had broken it. He couldn't bring himself to care. His father's condition hadn't improved significantly. William was still weak, his movements slower, his speech flatter. The doctors assured them that this was typical for a man his age recovering from cardiac trauma, but the explanation didn't sit right. Daniel suspected there had been more damage than anyone was willing to admit. Not physical, necessarily, but something subtler, psychological, emotional. William had once been sharp, disciplined, and articulate. Now, even on good days, he drifted into long silences, his eyes unfocused, his hands twitching slightly as though disturbed by some memory he couldn't verbalize. Mary had tried to return to normalcy in her own way. She baked cookies for the staff, left thank you notes on the nurse's desk, tried to reassure them that not all trust had been lost. But her gestures were met with polite awkwardness, sometimes a forced smile, sometimes nothing at all. She carried the tension in her shoulders, in the new habit she had developed of clutching her wedding ring whenever someone unfamiliar entered the room. She didn't talk much about Haley anymore, but Daniel could see the betrayal working its way through her system like a slow poison. The real fracture, though, came between Daniel and the administration. Despite their assurances of action, progress was slow. The hospital had placed Haley on leave, but no formal charges had been filed yet. The internal investigation was underway, but confidential. Every time Daniel requested an update, he was told the same thing. The matter was under review. Meanwhile, Haley had disappeared. No public statement, no police report, no license suspension visible in the public registry. It was as if the hospital was dragging its feet, hoping the family would move on, that the storm would pass without escalation. Daniel didn't want a lawsuit. He didn't care about compensation or headlines. What he wanted was accountability, real, visible accountability. Someone had to say it aloud. A nurse had betrayed her duty of care, had compromised a patient's recovery, and had done so under the nose of an entire institution that failed to notice. The silence from the administration felt like complicity. And the more Daniel thought about it, the more it fueled his anger. He began keeping a journal, documenting every interaction, every unanswered email, every awkward silence from a staff member. He recorded changes in William's behavior, took photos of his bruises, archived audio from doctor visits. He didn't trust anyone to tell the full story, so he began building the story himself, brick by brick, fact by fact. It wasn't paranoia. It was defense. Mary didn't agree with his approach. For her, the damage had already been done, and the only path forward was healing, not legal battles or media exposure. She wanted peace, for William's sake, for her own. The idea of turning their private pain into a public spectacle frightened her. She worried it would cause more harm than good, that it would turn them into a sideshow, that it would take the last bit of dignity from a man who had already lost so much. Their arguments were quiet but sharp. Daniel accused her of being too trusting, of wanting to believe in systems that had failed them. She accused him of being obsessed, of letting his need for control blind him to the toll it was taking on all of them. They stopped talking about Haley entirely. Instead, they spoke in code about the situation, about the fallout, about what comes next. Their conversations became brief, mechanical, focused solely on William's medication schedule or discharge plans, but beneath the tension, the guilt lingered. Mary blamed herself for trusting Haley. Daniel blamed himself for not acting sooner, and neither of them dared to ask William how he felt about any of it. He had grown quieter with it. Each passing day, he answered questions when asked, nodded politely to doctors, but rarely volunteered information. The only time he reacted strongly was one evening when a new nurse, young, with blonde hair and a tight ponytail, entered the room during the night shift. William's body stiffened. His hand clenched the side of the bed. His breath quickened. Mary noticed first and gently asked if he was all right. William didn't respond. He simply stared at the nurse with wide, frightened eyes until she left the room. After that, Daniel insisted on being present during every evening check-in. The hospital, meanwhile, remained diplomatically quiet. Administrators avoided eye contact when they passed Daniel in the lobby. The few nurses who still acknowledged him did so with clipped tones and tight smiles. Janet, their attorney, advised patience. Legal channels moved slowly, she reminded him. They had done what was right. Now they had to wait. But Daniel wasn't good at waiting. Not when justice felt so unfinished. He debated releasing the footage to the press, just enough to provoke a response to force the hospital's hand. But he hesitated, not because he feared backlash, but because he feared what it would do to his father. The quiet dignity William had carried throughout his life had already been shaken. Would he want to be the face of a public scandal? Would he want the world to see him so vulnerable, so broken? And so, the conflict remained suspended like a storm that refused to break. The family continued their visits. The hospital continued its silence. And Daniel, caught between the two, waited for anything that would tip the balance. A moment of truth. A sign of remorse. An acknowledgement that the people who were supposed to care had failed. But none came. The room remained sterile. The hallways remained bright. The machines continued their indifferent rhythm. And somewhere behind it all, Daniel's anger settled into something colder, more permanent, not rage, but resolve. He hadn't started this war. But if the hospital thought silence would make it disappear, they had underestimated what it meant to be a son who refused to look away. It was 3 weeks after William was discharged from St. Joseph Medical Center when the official letter arrived. Folded into a plain white envelope and stamped with the seal of the Ohio Board of Nursing, it contained the bureaucratic finality of a quiet reckoning. Haley Bryant's license had been suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing. The board cited multiple violations of ethical care standards, though the details were vague and no criminal charges were listed. There was no admission of wrongdoing, no apology. Just a thin packet of printed words and legal phrasing that attempted to summarize the weight of what had occurred. Daniel held the letter in his hands for several minutes before passing it to his mother. Mary read it silently, her expression unreadable, and placed it on the dining room table without a word. By then, William was home. The hospital bed had been delivered and installed in the sunroom, the only space in the house that could accommodate the equipment while still offering natural light. His movements were slow but more stable now. He used a walker to get from the bed to the bathroom, and he ate with assistance. Some days he spoke clearly. On others, his words tangled together like thread pulled too fast from a spool. The doctor said recovery would be gradual, possibly incomplete. They couldn't say for sure what effect the unauthorized medications had had on his system. Too much time had passed, too many variables unaccounted for. All they could do was monitor, adjust, and wait. Mary resumed her role as caregiver with quiet diligence. She organized medication into labeled trays, tracked appointments on a clipboard, and kept a detailed notebook of William's vitals and symptoms. She rarely left the house. Her presence became part of the furniture, constant, stable, reliable. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer offered platitudes about healing or forgiveness. Her optimism had hardened into something less visible, more private. A kind of survival. Daniel visited daily, sometimes staying late into the evening. He helped where he could, adjusting William's pillows, checking in with doctors, taking over the occasional shift so Mary could rest. But even in those quiet hours at his father's side, he could feel the rift that had formed between them. William never asked about the camera. He never mentioned Haley. It was as if a portion of his memory had been sealed off, inaccessible to even himself. Or perhaps he remembered everything but chose to let it remain buried. Trauma didn't always scream. Sometimes it silenced. The footage remained in Janet's office, locked away in a secure file. She advised Daniel not to release it to the media, at least not yet. The hospital had fulfilled its minimal obligations. Haley was no longer working, and the legal process was underway, albeit slowly. But there was still risk. Releasing the video publicly could jeopardize the integrity of future proceedings. Worse, it could turn their private grief into spectacle. And what would that bring? Outrage, maybe. A few headlines. But would it bring healing? Would it restore what had been taken? Daniel didn't know the answer. He often replayed the events, in his mind, trying to trace where the turning point had been. Was it the moment he noticed the bruises? The first time William flinched at the sound of footsteps? Or had it started long before that, in the blind comfort of trust? The worst part was not the betrayal, but the realization that they had welcomed it into their lives with open arms. They had smiled back. They had thanked her. In the weeks that followed, Daniel found himself hyper-aware of everything. He scrutinized every interaction, second-guessed every word spoken by healthcare workers, even in other settings. When a home nurse was assigned to assist Mary part-time, Daniel insisted on background checks, interviews, monitoring schedules. Mary didn't argue. Trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt. Not even in the quiet corners of a familiar home. They heard nothing more from Haley. No letter, no explanation, no attempt at defense. She had vanished, absorbed back into the anonymity from which she had come. Her name faded from conversations, even among the staff still in touch with the family. The hospital issued no statement. There was no follow-up, no closure. Months passed. Seasons changed. The sunroom filled with different light as summer gave way to fall. William grew stronger. In small ways, a longer walk, a clearer sentence, a rare laugh. But he was not the same. Something in his spirit had fractured. He no longer read books or corrected news anchors on historical inaccuracies. He stared out the window more often now, as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. Mary began painting again. Small canvases at first, flowers, rooftops, skies. She said little about why. Daniel suspected it was her way of building a world she could control, one where colors stayed where they were put and nothing disappeared without reason. Daniel, for his part, returned to work but never stopped watching. He joined advocacy forums for patient rights, read medical ethics reports in the evenings, subscribed to newsletters about surveillance technology and caregiver misconduct. It was an obsession. It was preparation. If it could happen once, it could happen again. He wouldn't be caught off guard. Not again. And yet, even as he buried himself in structure, the question lingered. Had justice truly been served? Haley had been removed, yes. But the system that allowed her to thrive unquestioned, unexamined, remained intact. No one at the hospital lost their job. No internal policies were rewritten. The silence that followed was not accountability. It was strategy. On the one-year anniversary of William's discharge, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. No celebration, just a meal. William sat at the head of the table, thinner but upright. Daniel raised a glass, offered a simple toast. To endurance, he said. To what remains. Afterward, Mary lit a candle on the back porch, the kind she used to place in the window during storms. She didn't explain why. She didn't have to. Inside, Daniel stood in the sunroom, looking at the spot on the wall where the hidden camera had once been. The frame was gone, replaced by a watercolor Mary had painted a pale blue sky over a quiet lake. It was peaceful, still, but Daniel knew better than to mistake stillness for safety. Sometimes the most dangerous things didn't move at all. Sometimes they smiled. He turned off the light and walked away. But in his mind, the camera was still there, watching, remembering, waiting.